Well, you can't win them all, and unfortunately, the tapered shaft on this engine, as well as the bolt pattern for the bell housing, it's not compatible with the power heads I have up there. So, it's a good engine. Unfortunately, it's going to have to wait to get a new generator head. And as far as the stator goes, the bad stator, I mean, visually, it looks pretty good for a bad stator. Really, the only issue I could find is right there. There's that little burn mark, and that's all it takes. Unfortunately, that was the hot spot that led to the failure of leg one and leg two, and now we are where we are. So I'm going to check online just to see if that stator is available, new or used. I'm assuming not, and even if it is, it's probably cost prohibitive. So I'm going to conclude the video at this point, unless of course I find something of interest as far as that stator goes. And this engine, it'll be a good engine for another project. Anyway, I hope this video helps someone. Thanks for watching. Hey guys, welcome back. So today we're working on this Honda GX390. This engine came from an NAC generator. I actually made a 3-part series on it quite some time ago. To make a long story short, the stator ended up being bad, so I harvested the engine, fully expecting to utilize it, and as you can see, I haven't. It's been sitting on a shelf for about 2.5 years. So yeah, some of you might be wondering, why haven't I used this? I've had plenty of generators in that time that needed an engine. And I guess the simple answer is that the bell housing is not correct. It's kind of an oddball size. It's wider than most. So I could just remove it. It bolts right onto the engine, just 4 bolts, and put on the proper bell housing. The problem is the tapered shaft. This is the same type of shaft that Honda clones use, and Honda clones don't have removable bell housings. The bell housing is actually part of the cover. So if we want to use the bell housing, we have to actually swap out the whole thing. So I guess the question is, can a Honda clone engine cover from a Generac be swapped onto an OEM Honda engine? That I am not sure the answer of, but I suspect it can. And that's what we're going to find out today. So let me get you set up a little bit better and get going on this. So we'll start by getting this bell housing off, which oddly enough is removable. This is probably the first engine I've seen with this type of tapered shaft that has a removable bell housing. And you can see we do have quite a bit of oil on this block. It looks like the main seal was leaking. And believe it or not, this engine was cleaned already by me 2.5 years ago. Not behind the bell housing, but this thing was a complete mess. So even if the cover that I'm going to try to swap on here doesn't work out, we do need to at least fix that issue. Before I pull off the end cover, I do need to get some of this dirt off. The engine's also full of oil, so we need to get that out as well. It'll be interesting to see what this engine looks like inside. Although the oil's coming out clean, the first time I changed the oil on this was a complete mess. The oil kind of had a greenish tint and came out looking like water, so I half expected this engine to have a knock, if not be blown up. And, well, it was neither. So, yeah, I'm guessing at a minimum there is some sludge in there that we do need to clean out. All right, let's crack these bolts loose. We'll just prop this up a bit. Although I drained the oil, there's definitely some still in there. So by tilting it back, hopefully we're not going to spill too much of it out. Yeah, things look surprisingly good inside this engine. I was kind of worried based on the oil that came out of it the first time I changed it. You know, there is some sludge on the bottom, but overall not too bad. And as far as the covers go, you know, this is the OEM Honda one we just pulled off, and this one's the clone. You know, they do seem to be identical. I was really worried about this governor, thinking that it could have a different gear, but they seem to be the same size. They're both helical gears with 3 weights. So I think this is going to work. Now, this cover, it needs to be gone through. The ball bearings are not very good. This one's crunchy. And this one, although it feels good, has a bunch of corrosion on it. So we need to swap those out, you know, clean off this old gasket material. But before we do that, you know, I do have 2 new ball bearings. So let's just fit that on this engine, make sure that they fit properly. And then I'm going to actually take this cover as is, just slide it on, make sure everything meshes the way that it should. All right, let's give these a try. These are actually from Generac. Since we're using a Generac cover, I ordered the bearings from the vendor. And it looks like the main crank bearing fits fine. And then we have this other smaller one, which is for the counterbalance weight. And that is also a good fit. So good, that's going to work out. The camshaft actually doesn't have a ball bearing. It just rides in a bushing that's kind of machined right into the cover. So let's get these off. We'll just try fitting the clone cover as is and make sure that everything goes together like it should. It seems like the main ball bearing on the crank is hanging up. So I'm just going to clean this a little bit with some Scotch-Brite. We'll try this again. Yeah, something's not right. Yeah, something doesn't feel right. Seems to be hung up here on the main ball bearing on the crank. Though it should fit. It's hard to tell what it's hanging up on. You know, there is a fairly decent gap going all the way around, and I know it's hard for you to see, but from what I can see, there's nothing binding, you know, as far as the camshaft and the counterweight and even the governor gear goes. You know, it seems to be hanging up right on the crank. So my best guess is that the oil seal is somehow preventing it from going all the way on. So I'm going to pull that oil seal off, and we'll try this again. Oh, yeah, there we go. That's all it was. The oil seal was hanging things up. So now the case goes all the way in. So I'm just going to add a couple bolts, rotate the engine slowly, and just make sure nothing is binding or feels odd. I think it sounds pretty good. So I think we're going to be okay using this cover on this engine. So I'm going to pull it back off. We'll get the old bearings out, put the new in, as well as replace that oil seal, and then finalize that install. Most likely I'm going to have to apply some heat to free this ball bearing. And one thing I got to be careful of is not applying too much heat. I could melt this governor. It is just plastic. And there's also a tight clearance between the outer race on the ball bearing and the governor gear. So if I'm not careful, you know, I could break this or damage it. So we'll try to take it easy and hopefully not cause any damage. Okay, beautiful. That came out without too much issue. So that just leaves this little guy right here. Now this is a blind hole. I can't do what I did over here. I actually have a special slide hammer which should be able to pop that out. The idea on this is that you insert it through the inner diameter here, and then you crank down on this bolt, which spreads this open, and then it grips kind of under the bottom of that inner race. Now, I just measured the inner race. It's actually 15 millimeters, and this is 15.5, so that's not going to work. And I do have the next size down, which supposedly will go to 17 millimeters, but yeah, it's quite loose in there, so we're going to have to expand it quite a bit to get this to work. Easier said than done. Wow. I ended up sanding this down to just less than 15 millimeters. This other one supposedly will expand to 17 millimeters, but that was about as far as I could get it. And this one I think will fit now. But it is going to be a tight fit. So it's actually a couple hours later, and I put the new bearings in the freezer. You know, they should be just about ready to install. But before I do that, I just want to get all this gasket material off. There's also some RTV. So we'll get that off as well. And then I'm going to clean this up. I want to get all the debris out of the cover. And I might spend a little bit more time cleaning down here. You know, at this point, there is a bit of a stain, but nothing like it was. You know, I'll put a clip up of me opening this engine, and you know, I think you'll see the aluminum was stained really bad on this engine. And although I didn't show it, that stain extended on the cover as well. From about here down, it was just jet black. So I'm not sure what was in that oil, but it was pretty bad. It cleaned up pretty well. So now I'm just going to apply some heat and attempt to drop the bearings in place. Perfect. Okay, that went pretty well. At least for the second one. The first one was a little bit hard to get in, but it did go in, so the bearings are good. And now we just need to get a new oil seal in. So I'm thinking we're going to have to prop this with some wood on the back because the governor gear kind of goes too far down, and if we try to tap that new seal in, we're going to end up damaging that governor. So just a bit of oil, both on the seal and the engine cover. And you can use a socket to kind of tap this in place. You know, if we're lucky, we can get it started without that. And it's actually going in just by pushing it. So we can probably get away with not using a socket in this case. And we're good. I started to clean the engine block off camera and realized quickly that I was starting to get into trouble over here. I just couldn't get a blade in because the cam is actually slightly raised, so I can't effectively get the gasket off. So I resorted to the carbide scraper that was working well, but it started to kind of make a mess here in the gear. So I think the best thing to do is just get the cam and the counterbalancer out. That way they stay nice and clean. We'll finish getting the gasket off and then clean up the sludge in the bottom and then put this all back together. And we're going to have to double check the valves as well, because now the push rods are just kind of floating. They might actually fall down while cleaning. So when we put these back, chances are the push rods aren't going to be in the right spot. I really don't like using carbide scrapers on aluminum. They are very effective at taking off the gasket, but also the aluminum. But this gasket, it is seriously baked on. I'm just applying a bit of assembly lube to the lifters. You know, they're already oiled, so they don't need it for lubrication, but the assembly lube helps that lifter stay in place, so it gives me time to put the camshaft back in. I'm actually going to start with the counterbalancer, and most likely we're going to lose lifters before we get over there. But the timing mark for the counterbalancer is right there, and there is a corresponding mark on the balance shaft. And now we have to rotate the engine because the timing mark for the camshaft, it's not timed in such a way that you can get both in at the same time. There are two different gears and two different marks. So the mark we're aiming for is on this gear. It's right there. Perfect. And just to show you, we have one mark right there and the other mark's right there. Now, it's a little bit hard to tell they're lined up, so you actually got to pull the cam out because the gear kind of spins when it goes in. But when you bring it out like that, you can see that dot is on that tooth and this dot is in between those two teeth. So we're on time as far as the valve timing goes. And the timing mark for here is actually right there. So we need to rotate the engine a bit to get those marks to line up. So let's do that and just double check. Yeah, we're perfect. The dot is right there on that tooth, and the other dot is on the crank gear right there. So we are perfectly in time. Now, the counterbalancer, you would think timing wouldn't matter, but it does. And actually for two reasons. I think the biggest one is that the weights on the counterbalancer can actually collide with parts on the crankshaft. So if it's not spinning in sync with that, then you could get binding and things could break. And also, if you note, when I turn the crankshaft clockwise, this shaft turns counterclockwise. So they're spinning in different directions, and that's what helps this engine to run smooth. Everything's been oiled up on the cover. So let's get it installed. And hopefully we don't get hung up on the oil seal. Or close. Okay, good, we're in. I'm just gonna put the bolts in, just snug them up, and then we'll torque it down. I haven't looked up the spec yet on this cover. The bolts actually felt fairly loose when taking it apart, but I am 99% certain it should be 200 inch-pounds. So I'm actually going to start at 80. I'll double check the spec and then bring it up the rest of the way. I just double checked the spec, and it calls for 17 foot-pounds, which converted to inch-pounds is 204, which is right there. All right, let's take a look at the push rods. They most likely fell out of place. And man, that is a stuck bolt. There we go. So we'll put the push rods back where they belong and also set the valve clearance while we're here. Yeah, I think we need to get this tin out of the way. Noticing quite a bit of oil here around the valve cover. So I do have a new gasket. We will get that replaced. And I think I'm also going to check the oil seal on the front of the engine because there seems to be a trail of oil kind of leading in that direction. So likely that seal is bad as well. But for now, let's deal with this problem and then we'll turn our attention to the issue up there. Yeah, it seems like both push rods are properly on the rocker arms. And I guess the question is, are they on the lifters? So let's rotate the engine, see that both valves are opening and closing. And if they are, we'll just stop rotating the engine when one of the valves is fully depressed, and then set the clearance on the other. And I'm also noticing the flat side on this valve should be facing down, and it's not. So let's turn the light on so you guys can see a little bit better. And I want to rotate this if I can without losing the valve in the engine. So that right there looks perfect. And this one is also a little bit off. So the reason why you want the flat side down is because the rocker will end up hitting the side of the retainer for the spring. And that's eventually going to cause damage to that retainer and cause it to fail, letting the valve fall into the engine. So like this, it should not be a problem. It doesn't feel like much clearance on that exhaust. Honda calls for 8 thousandths of an inch on the exhaust, plus or minus a thousandth. And I can tell you that that valve is tight. The 8 does not fit. Let's try a 6. Does not fit. And how about, let's try a 4. Doesn't fit. So yeah, that exhaust valve is really tight. 2.5 thousandths just fits. So that absolutely has to be adjusted. So let's loosen this up. We'll set the valve and move on to the other. It's on there. There we go. I'm going to start with the 9 thousandths feeler gauge because usually I lose clearance when I start to tighten up this second nut. So 9 feels pretty good. Let's snug these up a bit and double check. Let's try the 8. Yeah, and the 8 is now too tight. So because I didn't tighten this nut up all the way, we're not locked completely in place, but we've taken out the play between the threads. So we should get a more accurate adjustment now. All right, and 8 fits. Just adding a little bit more drag. That feels pretty good. An 8 no longer fits. Let's try a 7. That would be on the low side of the spec. And the 7 fits fine. So we're between a 7 and an 8. So that is good. Let's set the intake. And the intake should be 6 thousandths plus or minus a thousandth. And it feels loose. Yeah, this 6 goes in there and doesn't make any contact. Let's try a 7. Nope, quite loose. So I would say this engine has quite a few hours on it, and nobody has adjusted the valves. Let's try a 13. 13 fits with a little bit of drag, so yeah, we are way out of spec on that one. I will initially set this to a 7. Which is right there. Seven's too tight. So is a 6. We need to back off a little bit. All right, we're just at a 6 now. And the 6 is perfect. So the valves are all set. We just need to clean this up carefully without dropping too much in the engine. To get this blower housing off, it's usually easiest to pull the carburetor first. Oftentimes the blower housing hangs up when trying to clear that carb. Plus, we have to pull it off anyway. I'm noticing a few issues here. And I guess first off, this has a vacuum servo that is supposed to open the choke up once it pulls vacuum from the intake manifold. So right now, this should be choked, and instead it's not. And even when you operate the choke manually, it doesn't close the choke. So yeah, it has to come off anyway to fix that issue. That spring might be on backwards. We'll check that out when reassembling. It's actually not half bad in here. I mean, there is some dirt, but I wouldn't call it oily dirt. That said, though, there is some evidence of a leak if you look down at the bottom. It is quite wet and definitely dark with oil. And if there's any doubt, you just need to look at the back side of the blower housing. This is supposed to be yellow, and instead it looks like there is a bunch of oil. So, yeah, that oil seal, I would say, is leaking and needs to be replaced. So in order to get to it, we do need to peel a bunch of stuff off here. We need to pull the ignition coil, the starter, the cup, the fan, and the flywheel. So yeah, let's get to it. All right, I thought that would come out. Maybe it's stuck. Ideally, I would use my puller to get this off. The issue is these bolt holes, although they're threaded, they are very small bolts, and nothing in my puller set fits that. So let me just take a second, kind of go through my nuts and bolts and see if I have anything that'll fit in there. Unfortunately, that's the best I could come up with. One bolt that threads in, but I need 3, and this one's way too short. So that is out. So instead, we're going to have to use a method that wouldn't be my first choice. But the idea is you thread the nut on just flush with the crankshaft. You put a little bit of pressure to take the play out, and then you pop it with a hammer, and that should shock the flywheel off the tapered shaft. It seems like we're hung up. There are 2 coils behind here, and there's magnets on the inside. So potentially it's just a magnet sticking to one of the coils, or maybe one of the magnets is falling off. Yeah, it's just the magnet sticking to a coil. Yeah, definitely leaking oil. You can see it all around the crankshaft and, of course, running down. You know, this coil is soaked in it as well as the block. So before I can get this seal out, I think I'm going to get these coils out of the way, and that'll just give us better access to what we need. The easiest way to get this seal out is to put a little hole right in the center, being careful not to nick the outer race or the crankshaft. And once you have that pilot hole, you can put a screw in there. Again, being careful not to gouge any of the metal or dig into the ball bearing behind there. But once you have enough threads engaged, you should be able to use this screw to pull the seal out. And I think I'm going to use a brass drift to tap the seal in, at least until it's flush with the engine. And then I'm going to switch over to a socket to drive it just a little bit deeper. That should do it. So this is the other coil I have. It's from a Honda clone, but it is an exact replacement for the coil that was on the top here. This coil is usually used for charging the battery, which this generator will have, or I should say this engine, because it does have electric start. Now the bottom coil, that one's used for accessories. You know, in this case, we do have an idle control solenoid, which we may not use. You know, it really depends on what application I put this engine in. And a lot of times that power actually comes from the generator and not necessarily a coil on this side. So I can add that back in the future. But this coil, it's, yeah, not in great shape with all that oil. And again, don't foresee needing it on this engine. Before I get the cup and fan on, I need to get the starter back in because the fan actually partially blocks these bolts and you can't torque them down. So when going to install the fan, just be aware that it is keyed. You have to get it right in order for it to sit down. So these two are closer together than that one. So the orientation should be like that. And it sits down the way that it should. Now, the cup, it's the same thing. We have a little stud right there, which aligns to that location. So if you install it any other way, it's not going to sit down properly. And something's going to come loose and potentially cause some damage. The flywheel needs to be torqued down to 86 foot-pounds, and to do that, we have to lock the engine up. So right now I have the piston at the bottom of the compression stroke, so the valves are closed. And then when we go to tighten or torque down the flywheel, that piston will come up against the rope. The valve's still closed, and that will lock the engine up. So we should be able to torque it down at that point to 86 foot-pounds. So I set the coil as far away from the flywheel as possible. And now I'm just going to rotate the engine until the magnet is underneath the coil. And you use a business card that's about 0.010 of an inch thick, which will set the perfect gap. So you just loosen those bolts, the magnet should pull it in, and then snug it down. Perfect. Cover's all cleaned up, both inside and out. So all the oil's removed. There is a bit of surface rust, but overall it's in pretty good shape and ready to reinstall. Anyway, while cleaning it, I discovered this tag right here. This is an EPA label stating that it meets the 1995 emission regulations. So this engine is actually almost 30 years old, and Honda actually only came out with the GX390 in 1991. So this is an early model. We'll get this reattached. This is the idle down solenoid. When energized, it bumps the governor arm to the left, which closes the throttle plate into the idle position. So I don't plan on wiring it right now, but I'm going to keep it with the machine just in case. I think I'm going to replace that anti-surge spring. I mean, technically it would still work, but it is deformed, and I do have a new one. So the purpose of that spring is to take out the slop where the governor rod connects both to the governor arm and over to the carburetor. That little bit of slop will cause an otherwise healthy engine to surge. So by putting a spring holding the governor arm and the throttle plate together, it takes that slop out so that these two parts move together without that play right there. So if your engine's surging and you're sure it's not the carb, double check that you have the spring. All right, now we'll get the auto choke installed. I think I installed it incorrectly last time. In order for this to be choked, we need this in the forward position. And when you look at this auto choke mechanism, this is what connects to the choke. And technically you could install it like that, which is what I did. And in this case, I think it should be installed more towards the front, which will default this to having the choke applied. And once the engine starts, the servo should pull the choke to the open position. And for now, I'm going to leave the airbox off, but I'm going to use this plate right here so when I clamp down, I don't destroy that gasket. All right, we are in the home stretch here. We just need to figure out this spaghetti of wiring, and then we should be good for contact. I think the big exception, though, is that I have not added oil yet to this engine, and there's a good reason for that. I don't have a cap that fits, at least not here. I think I do in the storage locker. I have a couple blown up engines, and I'm willing to bet one of those engines has the cap I need, so we will revisit that in a bit. But for now, let's get this sorted out. All right, so first things first, let's deal with the oil sensor. We have this yellow wire coming out of the engine that connects to the yellow wire that goes to the oil module, which is right there. And then we have a black wire which goes to the ignition coil, which is right here. So, I mean, technically we could just hook it up like this, and then the oil switch can shut the engine down. The problem is I also need to shut the engine down, so we need to add a switch into the mix, and that's what this will do. I can mount it right there, and in fact I might, but this is in the way. So let's get that out of the way. We'll add the switch and then move on to everything else. And in case you're wondering, that was just there to hold wires, to kind of organize them. But it's in the way of the switch. So we will delete that. And let's get this cap off. Okay, there we go. And we'll disconnect this. So this is the feed from the low oil module, which we can plug in right there. And that splices off and goes right to the coil. And then this yellow wire we can connect probably right there. And that way when we turn this, well, to the off position, it'll send the ground to the coil, killing spark. I think we need a shorter bolt. Yep. I'm also going to add this heavy gauge wire back. This is for the electric start, so the other end would be connected to the negative on the battery. All right, good. So that takes care of the ignition system and the low oil system. The fuel solenoid we're not going to use, so I'm just going to plug these in together, and you don't need to use it. the normal position on that solenoid is open. So this engine will run just fine without this. The only time this is energized is when you have the proper switch. And when you shut the engine to the off position, then it routes power either from the charge coil under the flywheel or the generator to energize that solenoid. By doing that, it cuts the fuel flow, preventing a backfire and flooding. That said, though, a lot of generators of this size don't have it, and they run fine. So I don't think we're going to need it in this case. The auto idle, we're not going to connect. This is the charging coil, which again, we're not going to use at this time. So that doesn't leave a whole lot. You know, we have this wire harness right here, which we no longer need, so we can eliminate that. And then we just need to figure out which of these wires is positive and negative to trip the solenoid to engage the starter. So this harness, it's not utilized anymore. This would have gone up to the control panel in the NAC generator. But I do want to cut out this one wire that connects over here. You know, judging by the color, I would say this is negative. And then we have a white wire, which surprisingly seems to be positive because that's where we have it right there. And technically, I'm not sure if it matters on this solenoid as far as which one is positive and which one's negative, but sometimes it does. Some of these only have one wire running over to battery positive, and then it picks up the ground from the body of the solenoid. You know, in this case, it seems to be two wires, which is fine. But let's just double check. I'm going to strip that back. We'll just check the resistance, make sure it's going through a coil, and that it's not doing something else. All right, let's check the resistance. Don't know what it should be, but it shouldn't be a dead short. It should be something, I would say around, I don't know, 10 ohms, 100 ohms. And in this case, it's no ohms. So that is interesting. So I take back what I said. This wire that's connected to positive, I'm thinking is a battery charge wire. So if we take the wire coming out from behind the flywheel and put a diode right there, you know, those could then be connected and then it would charge the battery. So yeah, let me look around. I might have a diode and we can test that theory. So with that in mind, then most likely the body here is going to be picking up a ground. So let's put a probe there. And then if I touch the other side, we should see something. And we do. 4.8 ohms. So yeah, I think that gives us our answer. So let me grab a battery. I'm going to apply some power to the battery negative terminal. So this will make the whole thing negative. And then I'll touch this to battery positive, and we should hear this click. All right, let's give this a try. We'll hold this lead on the battery negative and touch the other to battery positive. And hopefully we hear this solenoid click. Beautiful. All right, let's see. I think I have a bin, actually several bins of Honda clone parts. So it looks like we have some in here and some more in here. So let's look at this one first, since it's a little bit more accessible. So we got some push rods, piston, a bunch of heads. Another piston. And that's what we need. We have 2 caps and some more push rods. So let's bring this back. I think these are going to be the right size. So what do you think? I think it's going to fit because it's Generac orange. And this is a Generac end cover. And yeah. We are back in business. So let's fill it up with oil. I want to put this on a test stand and we'll try to start it. Just going to pull this wheel off. Yeah, I'm not sure I like that. That positive is really close to the metal, which is all going to be negative. Ideally, probably go in something like that. But I'm not sure it's going to work because there's a cutout on this side. So, yeah, I'm not sure which one I like better. Good enough. Let's just test this, make sure the starter works, and we can hear the engine spinning at a higher speed. I want to make sure it sounds good. Beautiful. Let's add some fuel. Actually, I'm getting ahead of myself here. We have no exhaust, so let's throw one on. So we're going to need to use this end housing for the stator to support the exhaust. There's a bracket right here. So I'm just going to secure this. And then I need to find an exhaust that's the right length. They're all kind of custom given the length of the stator. So I have a couple to choose from. Hopefully one will fit. I might have to pull this tin to get a wrench on these nuts. Looks like the needle and seat are working. The fuel stopped right there. So we should be able to run it, I'd say, for about 15 or 20 seconds. So all we have to do is trigger that electric start and it should fire up. The choke is on. We'll take a look at that once it's running to see if it shuts off. And I've also rigged up a light to that coil. So if the coil works, we will be producing about 25 watts. So I'm going to set you up on the other side. I'll hit the electric start and hopefully this thing comes to life. All right, let's give this a try. I've got the ignition turned on. Yeah, I moved the light over there so we can keep an eye on that. Now, hopefully this thing starts and sounds good without blowing apart. If it does start, we are going to have to bring the speed up. I did take the tension off the spring. So let's touch this wire for the solenoid to the positive and hopefully get a good result. Contact. Yeah, and we get nothing. Let me manually choke it because just cranking the engine actually opened that choke a bit. So right now we are closed. Let's try it again. Contact. Amazing. For a 29-year-old Honda, it sounds fantastic. It started right up, ran without issue, and we're even making a little bit of power. So, going into this, I thought this was going to be a pretty easy thing to do, and it was. But this machine really needed kind of a lot of maintenance to get it back up to where it should be. And at this point, I think we have an engine that is ready to be put back in service. And, this used to be a Honda. It still is, but we've now converted it to be a Honda clone, or at least compatible with one. And I have several Honda clones that are in need of an engine. So I would say in the next few weeks, you're going to see this engine again, hopefully bringing a dead machine back to life. So I hope this video helps someone. Thanks for watching.